Strategic Affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. I am Surya Gangadharan. Myanmar's generals and democracy present very tough choices for India. And to discuss that issue, I have with me Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. He was India's envoy in Myanmar somewhere in 2002, and he has carried with him considerable interest in that country. He has closely followed developments there. And today we're going to talk to him about what are India's options there, what are India's choices, and how he sees developments in that country. Sir, good evening and welcome to you.
Good evening to you, Surya. It is a pleasure and privilege for me to be here.
Thank you, sir. So, first off, what is your reading of the current situation there? Is it we keep reading all these alarmist, all these reports about the economy tanking, COVID spreading all over the place, more than 800 people dead at the last estimate. What is your reading of the situation there?
This is a very timely discussion and a very timely question because we are heading to a milestone. It would be very soon at the end of this month, 6 months since the imposition of the new regime following the coup on 1st February. Now, frankly, from 1st February onwards, it has been regretfully a downhill journey for Myanmar in all respects. You already have hinted about a kind of humanitarian disaster which seems to be building up there, partly fueled by the fact that the economy has suffered very badly. The World Bank now says that this year it would be shrinking by 18%. There is a third wave of COVID, which is exacting a very heavy cost. And then, on the people's level, the unemployment is rising, jobs have shrunk, sanctions have been put into effect, and therefore people are really losing hope. So there is that aspect. Then on the political aspect, I think we can say objectively that a stalemate has descended. The military had hoped that using violence and brutality, it would be able to restore law and order quickly. I think it has failed to do so because there are incidents across the country from time to time. And then, of course, there is a whole host of ethnic armed organizations which are on their own stream, so to say. On the other hand, the democracy movement, which had hoped that it would completely stop the military in its tracks, has also failed. It has lost its momentum. And on top of this, ASEAN, which felt bold enough to offer an approach to mediation, even that initiative has not moved forward. So in effect, 6 months later, we find Myanmar into a terrible position today from all points of view.
So, what's the way forward? You mentioned end of this month. Are you hinting at something here?
We are not really expecting any dramatic change in this stalemate. By 6 months, I was simply underlining the fact that as we had expected back in February, that this change, the overthrow of a legitimate democratic government, the sudden imprisonment of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and the previous president, and many other leaders of the ruling party, NLD, all this would augur very poorly for the country because this would create instability, it would damage economy, it would weaken the country's fight against COVID, and it would complicate the relationships with the neighbors. All this, unfortunately, is proving true. And fundamentally, 6 months down the line, it is difficult to spot big rays of hope for this poor country at this stage.
Mm-hmm. So, what does a neighbor like India do at this point? We've been always talking about the need to keep the military happy, the Myanmar military. Does that case still hold? Don't we have some moral obligations to those people there?
Yes, indeed. For India, this is a serious issue. The emerging turbulence in Myanmar on the eastern flank of India at a time when there is sharply emerging turbulence in Afghanistan on the western part of India. Both these crises can impact on India's security and national interests and diplomacy, and therefore, your question is very, very appropriate. As far as Myanmar is concerned, the tough conditions which have emerged there in the past few months has already led to the beginning of uh, a kind of exodus of people from there onto our northeast, particularly Mizoram and Manipur. Nobody seems to have precise details, but reports have spoken of about 8 to 10,000 people already on our side of the border. The local provincial governments have been receptive, but they are under strict instructions from the central government to be very clear and not let people come and think that they can get refuge in India. As a result, the word probably has gone out, and the exodus from Myanmar has not become bigger than it already is. Similarly, the exodus from Myanmar on the other side into Thailand is still under kind of limited quantity. But the fear of Myanmar watchers, the apprehension is that if the economic conditions and the humanitarian conditions are not taken care of in Myanmar, then the implosion could result in exodus in all parts. And there are five neighbors. India and Thailand are major ones. And the other ones, as you are aware, are Bangladesh, Laos, and China. So there is a regional sense of insecurity about this.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to step out of your diplomatic cloak and tell me what are the three options for India with Myanmar? What should we do today?
Yes, now let us focus very much on Myanmar. Three policy options. We can try to spell them out through critical analysis. First, what exactly are India's primary interests in Myanmar? History, culture, commonality of people, all that is very relevant. But what are the hardcore interests? Hardcore interest number one is that Myanmar's instability should not trigger insecurity in the northeast, insecurity and instability. The second is very much that we remain always concerned about China's growing footprint in Myanmar. It already has grown quite substantially in the past 3, 4 years. We would very much like that to remain within limits. And the third is that our entire economic investment in that country that should remain safe and sound. So, from the viewpoint of these hardcore national interests, I think India's options are somewhat limited, but India is following a very, in my view, a very calibrated policy. And this has essentially three elements which respond to the options issue. First, India is clear that it is on the side of democracy. India itself is the largest democracy in the world, and therefore India would like to support the people of Myanmar. But India is not in the business of exporting its own democracy model anywhere, least of all in Myanmar. And therefore, India can only extend moral, political, diplomatic support to the cause. But secondly, it has also to respect the need for India to keep its communication channel open to the government of Myanmar, that is, to the military, which has had cordial relationship with India in the past, which helped India manage the Northeast's security challenges for the past several years. Therefore, on the second level, India would very much like to remain in contact and in touch with the military rulers. And third, therefore, knowing that there is a serious problem developing in Myanmar, India feels that the first and foremost responsibility to resolve this matter rests with ASEAN the regional grouping, which has been dealing with this issue. It dealt with it in the past. It has been dealing with it for the last at least 3 or 4 months, since 24th April, when ASEAN held a summit and came up with a 5-point consensus plan. Now, you would again ask me that, ASEAN 5-point consensus
Yeah.
formula hasn't moved forward.
Yes,
So
it has
why
gone
have
nowhere.
you, yeah, why are you referring to it? Now, what I'm saying is that the framework is there, the political will is there, but all this can really change and progress further when two conditions are fulfilled. One is there has to be some basic willingness on part of the various political factions and military in Myanmar to say that, look, there is no solution of this through violence. Solution can only come through national dialogue and constructive settlement. So that will have to be there. And secondly, the region will have to assert itself more.
Do you think there's, I mean, the fact that we are deferring to ASEAN does suggest that we sense that we are between a rock and a hard place and there's nothing much we can do, since we seem tied by our interests and by our concerns of China and all that. So, is there perhaps space for some kind of a UN peacekeeping role there? Do you think that's something which is feasible?
Uh, to be very honest, I have kept in touch with this country for the last about 25 years. Even before
Yeah.
I went there as an ambassador, I was the head of division in the External Affairs Ministry. And since my tenure, I have studied a country closely and critically. As you probably know, I wrote a book also on
Yeah.
Myanmar-India relations. Uh, Based on that long perspective, I'm afraid that the UN does not really have much of a peacekeeping role to play there, because the people who wield power there, essentially military, which has been in the dominating position from 1948 when they got
Yeah.
independence, is totally opposed to the idea of UN role there. So much so that the present military ruler, General Min Aung Hlaing, and his government totally refused to let the envoy of UN Secretary General to visit Myanmar even once in the past 6 months. So, given that kind of allergy, it is clear. And of course, as you know, UN also does not have much of an appetite in terms of peacekeeping role. They've been playing
Yeah.
development role. Uh, so, what I'm essentially suggesting is that ASEAN has to be backed solidly by two sets of nations. One, the five neighbors, which essentially means that there has to be some basic understanding between Delhi and Beijing
Yeah.
that yes, ASEAN must go and do something that is feasible. And the second is that I think, the Western nations, which have been for far too long on their, trip of sanctions and condemnation and opposition to the military, they need to be persuaded by their own Quad partners, namely Japan, India, and Australia, that we have to be a bit more realistic and pragmatic when it comes to Myanmar.
Do you believe this message is going across, one to Beijing, the other to our Western partners? Are we talking to them in that way?
Uh, I'm fairly certain that when US Secretary of State Blinken arrives in Delhi tomorrow, and he has his extensive discussions planned with the government of India, Myanmar will figure quite prominently in this dialogue. So yes, answer is that India is talking to its Quad partners. It is very obvious. Uh, Whether India is talking to China, that is, really unclear given India-China relationship today
Yeah.
and given the sharp competition that India and China are engaged in the region. But I think what India needs to do even more, first, it is very active in the UN. I think our ambassador to the UN has been playing an active role in Security Council and General Assembly. More importantly, I think we have to keep assuring the premier or eminent ASEAN countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, that India is concerned about it, India has hardcore interests here, and India is willing to extend constructive support to all their mediatory efforts.
So I'm just a little skeptical, even cynical about ASEAN because they are basically traders, and they look at their pocket first before looking at anything else. So perhaps from what I read and what I understand, the Myanmar military has more stakes in, say, a regime like you have in Thailand, which is an authoritarian, thing similar to what you have in Myanmar. Even Vietnam, I'm told, has a good equation with the Myanmar military. Is there scope for some kind of a settlement of some kind, resolution through them?
No, your comments show that you have studied the problem quite closely. You are right in being skeptical about ASEAN. A lot of other Myanmar observers have the same view, essentially because ASEAN is suffering from internal divisions when it
Yeah,
comes to Myanmar. There is no doubt that there are countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, which want to be nicer to the military, let us say
yeah,
that.
yeah,
On the other hand, you have Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, which are really concerned seriously about what the military has done, namely to overthrow democracy and create further complications. We are not even referred here to the other preeminent problem, which is the Rohingya issue. 1
yeah,
million
yeah.
Rohingya refugees,
It's true.
driven from Myanmar, have been sitting in Bangladesh waiting to return, and Bangladesh has not been able to secure much success there.
Yeah,
So, given
absolutely.
this division within ASEAN, the skepticism about ASEAN is justified to quite some extent. But I have been a regional, scholar in regional affairs. I think the world is today heading in the direction where the global UN-like multilateral approaches are not working. Whether it is Afghanistan or Myanmar, the region is expected to shoulder more responsibility. It cannot be done by the superpowers. They are tired. They are fatigued. So just as you saw around Afghanistan, we are seeing how regional neighbors could develop a consensus and contribute to peacemaking there. We have to have the same formula, in my view, in Myanmar also. Neighbors have to develop a strong consensus, cohesiveness, and try to help this country if the country is willing to be helped.
So we have some questions from our viewers here. There's
Certainly.
one question from Prakhar Rustagi. He says India's support towards the 5 point consensus and quiet diplomacy is the right approach. He wants to know. I'm not sure what the 5 point consensus is.
Yes. And yes, I think the 5 point consensus or 5 point formula that ASEAN developed
I see.
with the concurrence of Myanmar was essentially that number one, there should be cessation of violence, which was basically violence by military.
Yeah.
Uh, Number two, the region should provide humanitarian assistance to Myanmar people who are suffering badly. Number three, there should be a national level dialogue among various political factions to decide as to what kind of democracy and governance system they want in future. Number four, there was mediation by ASEAN. And number five, there was the visit by the special envoy of the Secretary General of ASEAN to Myanmar. So these were the 5 points. India studied them, India followed, critically examined them, and India then articulated publicly its support for ASEAN's 5 point consensus and ASEAN's leadership. This was, soon after the summit back in April. This also received support at the UN as well. But as I said, because of ASEAN's division and because of lack of adequate signals from Myanmar, particularly the Myanmar military, progress has not really taken place.
Mhm. So we also have another question since you spoke about the UN. There's a question from Sarkas. Can you please elaborate on how the UN is more to development rather than peacekeeping? I think he's trying to imply that perhaps they are more into development rather than into peacekeeping operations of the kind that Myanmar would entail.
That is, I think, largely correct. UN through UNDP and other agencies of uh, devoted to development work have been fairly
Yeah.
active in Myanmar over the years. They've been helping children, women, a number of financial reforms and all that. But when it comes to sending UN troops for peacemaking, nation building, they've always stayed away, even though this country has suffered from a string of insurgencies right from 1948, and the repeated overthrow by the military of democracy rulers there. This was done, back in 1962 by General Nevin. It was done by Myanmar military when Madame Aung San Suu Kyi won the election decisively in 1990. And so essentially, UN had stayed away. Even now, when UN General Assembly just a few weeks back
Yeah.
decided to adopt a resolution. This was done not by unanimity, but with a quite a significant majority, where the essential idea was that this country needs to have democracy back, and UN supported it. So essentially, UN is giving a political signal. It's giving a clear idea that it is on the side of democracy, but it is expecting, in my view, regional players, regional powers
To
to
do the
try to
hard
do
work.
something more concrete.
So, last question. Russia has got profile in Myanmar seems to be increasing. Is this good, bad? I mean, what is the purpose?
So this is a new and significant development. Uh, in my reading, this is a positive and welcome development. First of all, because this amounts to some shrinking of China's role,
Yeah.
and some balancing, at least, between China and Russia, which is always good for a country like India, given the fact that India and Russia have had very close relationships. So I think we in Delhi need to welcome this. The only issue here is that this Russia Myanmar relationship right now looks predominantly military relationship, and Russia has made fairly clear
Yeah.
that it has chosen its friend. It is the military. So I think India will probably need to moderate that a little bit, given the fact that India is actually following a two-track policy of encouraging democracy, supporting democracy, but also keeping on good wicket with the military.
Okay. I have a last question from a viewer, Ma Tara. She says, now that China has made high-speed rail networks from Sichuan to Tibet, is Myanmar more worried about pro-China guerrillas in North Myanmar? Is that their main concern now, China?
Uh, well, I think this is, of course, a tricky question.
Yeah.
What happens in Tibet is, somewhat different as far as Myanmar is concerned. I think for the people of Myanmar today, as we began right in the beginning, it's a fundamental issue of health, life, livelihood, uh, employment, tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it is also very much about the fundamental issue as to whether they would be able to enjoy basic freedoms, basic liberties, at least the kind of hybrid democracy they had until uh, the coup was
Yeah.
proclaimed on 1st February.
Yeah.
So, as friends and neighbors and well wishers, all that we can really do from the bottom of our heart to wish the people of Myanmar the very best. They are passing through a very challenging position.
True.
People like Indians would like to help them, but first, they really also will have to signal that they are ready to be helped.
Yeah. On that note, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, we are completely at the end of our time. Thank you very much for that perspective. Really, no answers here until the region gets its act together. Some consensus emerges with ASEAN, with India, with some other countries perhaps, and of course also China. And the key question whether India and China are even talking about Myanmar remains up in the air. Thank you very much, sir. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And
Bye.
and for all of you out there who came with your questions and comments and observations, thank you very much. Please keep coming to our talks, chats such as this. It's a pleasure having you. And keep those comments and suggestions coming in. We're glad to answer them. Do follow us on our website, on Instagram, and other social media. Looking forward to meeting you again at our next chat. Thanks very much. Goodbye.